The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. When something goes wrong, how one responds can determine whether they're seen as a skilled crisis manager or a failure. And the people who have served as President of the United States provide examples of both. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. We've seen in our podcast where presidents have been faced with crises of various forms, and whether they met the challenge or made the problem worse plays a role in their historical legacy. In this episode, I'm joined by someone with a unique perspective on planning for and responding to the unexpected. Edward Segal has more than 30 years' experience as a crisis management expert, public relations consultant, journalist, and press secretary for members of Congress and political candidates. He is a leadership strategy senior contributor for Forbes.com, where he writes about crisis management and crisis communication-related news, issues, and topics. Edward has coached thousands of business executives, entrepreneurs, and public officials on how to deliver successful presentations to any audience and deal effectively with the media. In his latest book, The Crisis Casebook, Lessons in Crisis Management from the World's Leading Brands, Edward looks at various examples of how political leaders, public figures, companies, and organizations dealt with crises for better or worse, and helps the reader to understand what strategies worked and which could have been improved upon. It's a fascinating read, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to talk to him about it further. However, I couldn't resist the opportunity to ask him some questions about a previous book of his entitled Whistle Stop Politics, Campaign Trains, and the Reporters Who Covered Them. As you'll see, Edward brings a unique perspective to that topic as well. I cannot thank Edward enough for his time and the insight that he provided. You can find links to more information, including how to purchase a copy of your own of both of these books, on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. Without further ado, after these brief messages, let's get to my conversation with Edward. Edward, thank you so much for joining us today on the Presidencies Podcast.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to share my insights and advice.
Absolutely. And to get us started, talking about the Crisis Casebook, as this is your second book on the subject and you host podcasts on that subject of crises, what got you interested in studying crisis management and what drew you professionally to focus on this topic?
Well, I first got interested and involved in crisis management very early in my public relations career. I was vice president of a regional public relations and advertising agency here in the Washington area. And one of our clients at the time was Airbus, the European aircraft manufacturer. And they were criticized at the time for not providing jobs for U.S. workers. I helped launch a PR campaign where we showed how many Americans, in fact, were involved in making and assembling the plane and how many companies participated and the economic impact of those jobs on the U.S. economy. The agency used some of that same information in an advertising campaign as well to help deflect criticism about the company. The favorable publicity that we were able to generate about Airbus and the jobs it provided helped to mitigate the criticism about the company. And because of that early experience and the success of our efforts, I started to take a look around at how other companies and organizations, what they did to prevent, manage, and recover from different types of crisis situations. My work on Airbus and our success for the client led me to work on other agency clients that were facing other crisis-related issues and challenges. And in the rest of the years that followed for my career, I had the opportunity to work on dozens of other clients who faced a lot of different PR issues and challenges. And I often look back at my work on Airbus to see how crisis management has changed over the years, and it's been quite dramatic.
Absolutely. And that's one thing I really appreciated about your book is that you drew from so many different sources, so many different types of companies, organizations, institutions, And even, and of course, our listeners know we've seen in the history of presidential politics and governance that, also campaigns and politicians are involved in this as well. And so I really appreciated that diversity of topics, but still with that key idea of managing crises.
Well, the challenge in writing both of the books, the first one that came out on crisis management was in 2020. The latest one came out in September. The challenge was not finding case studies. The challenge was trying to figure out which ones to use. I had an embarrassment of riches, if you might say, about the best crisis management cases to share, what they could learn from them, what went wrong and what went right, and what readers could learn from those successes and failures.
Well, and in that token, as you draw as examples numerous contemporary politicians, government institutions, and political campaigns in your book, in your examination of various crises in the field of politics and public service, what trends have you noticed when the crisis is successfully managed, and what pitfalls have been common in cases where the response went wrong?
Well, it's a matter of do's and don'ts. What do they do and what don't they do? And maybe they should. So I've divided these up into success factors and failure factors. On the success factor side of the ledger, the basic questions, the trends are, do they have a crisis management plan in place? If they have one in place, do they have different plans to help address various kinds of crisis situations? Because the reality is, one plan is not likely to cover all possible crisis situations that a company or organization can have. And the more different plans you have, the more likely it is that you'll be ready when a different kind of crisis that maybe you didn't think of, that you'd never have to face when that hits, and you'd be more prepared to deal with it. Another success factor is if they have a plan or plans, have they updated it on a regular basis? Too often, companies will create a plan, put it in the binder, put it in the file on the computer, and basically forget about it. And when a crisis strikes, they may not have the right plan that reflects the latest threats and dangers to the company. So that's another reason why, on a regular basis, like at least every year, companies need to take a look at the plans that they have in place and make sure they reflect the latest realities as to what go wrong in their industry or in their profession. A good example is AI. 5 years ago, no one ever thought about AI or thought it was going to be a science fiction kind of thing years in the future. Well, now we're immersed in AI, and AI runs a risk of creating crisis situations for every company. And unless executives have taken a look at their plan and taken steps now to update their plans to reflect AI dangers, they're going to be in a really bad place when they have an AI related crisis. Another success factor is, have they appointed a crisis response team before it's needed? Uh, they should have a crisis team in place now before there's a crisis. Why? Because when a crisis strikes, they'll be running around trying to figure out who's going to work on addressing the crisis. So if they have a team in place now, they'll be saving a lot of time when that crisis strikes, and they'll be able to act on it immediately. Another success factor is, do they practice responding to worst case scenarios to ensure that the plans and the teams will work well together in pressure situations? If they don't test the plan and if they don't test the teams to make sure they're going to work, it's almost as if they don't have a plan and they don't have a team. They have no idea if it's going to work. The other side of the ledger is failure factors, and it's almost the reverse of the success factors. They're more likely to fail at dealing with a crisis if they don't have any plans, if they don't have any teams, and if they have the wrong attitude. That wrong attitude is if executives are absolutely, totally convinced that they would never have a crisis until, of course, they have a crisis and they have to scramble to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. The Crisis Management Hall of Shame is filled with examples of companies, organizations, and even high profile individuals who hoped, or perhaps they were in denial, that they would ever have a crisis. And they're automatically on the defensive when they have a crisis. And that's never a good place to be when there's a situation that can affect the company, the organization, the profits, the morale, and even the future of the company.
Yeah, and from the presidential history context, we've definitely seen some examples of that over time, where you have presidents that come in and things are going well, and then the crisis strikes and it becomes a disaster. But we also have some who have risen to the challenge of, being able to face crises and realizing that something's going to happen at some point. It's just how you deal with it. And so, Edward, I was going to ask you, what do you feel was the greatest crisis moment faced by a US president prior to the 21st century? And what qualities do you think enabled that president to rise to the challenge?
Well, wars or the possibilities of war are always a crisis for an American president. Of course, in the last century, we had the Korean War, we had Vietnam, we had World War One, we had World War II. But in more modern times, with the start of the nuclear age, I think the greatest crisis that we had was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. In fact, we recently celebrated, or marked, I wouldn't say celebrate, we marked the 63rd anniversary in October of that crisis. And President John F. Kennedy was president at the time, of course. And from a crisis management standpoint, I think he did a masterful job in avoiding nuclear war, which, of course, would have been the worst possible outcome of any crisis. Why did he do such a good job? Well, he looked for ways to diffuse the situation. And that's always step one in any crisis. What can you do to stop it or to mitigate it so it doesn't get any worse? Kennedy worked behind the scenes to help negotiate a peaceful end to the standoff and relied on back channel communications. I'm a member of the National Press Club here in Washington, D.C., and decades after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it came out how members of the press club served in an unofficial back channel role to help provide information back and forth between the White House and the Kremlin and Moscow. So that was another important reason that Kennedy was successful, and something else that today's leader should keep in mind. You don't always have to, try to resolve a crisis in front of the world. Sometimes, if you have back channel, off the record, confidential conversations with people, that could be a lot more effective way to address and end the crisis. I also think Kennedy was a success because he kept his eyes clearly laser focused on what he wanted to achieve. And he did his best to ensure that nothing happened that could derail his efforts or make matters worse, or, of course, to lead to nuclear war. Those were all important lessons that today's business executives and senior corporate officials, I think, should remember and apply when they're faced with a crisis at their own organizations.
Absolutely. And one key thing that you mentioned there, this idea of information, of making sure that you have channels to be able to get information, but also be able to share information. And I know that was one of the things with the Cuban Missile Crisis that was pivotal. And we've seen so many instances in presidential history where that was pivotal, but especially in that crisis, that information being able to get it and then send it out was key to bringing this from the crisis point.
Yes, information is key. And that's one of the things I talk about in my book, that before you can deal with a crisis, you need to have as much information about the situation. Otherwise, you're flying blind. And the basics I boil down to the five W's and the H: the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how. The more you know about the answers to the five W's and the H, the more likely it is that you'll be able to come up with an appropriate strategy and tactic and technique to help address the crisis. But just because you don't have all the information or any information, that doesn't mean you should just sit on your hands. At the very least, instead of doing nothing, you should issue what I call a temporary or a holding statement, that you're aware that something happened, you're looking into the situation, and you'll be taking steps to address it, and you'll be keeping people updated about what you find out and what you're doing about the situation. And having that statement ready, no matter what happens, that holding statement, and issuing it as soon as you know there's a crisis, that's really critical. Why? Because others might know more about your own crisis than you do, or at least go on social media, start to speculate or share or misinformation, spread disinformation. And if you're quiet about the crisis, the longer you are quiet and stay quiet, the more likely it is that you're going to lose control of the narrative and cede the narrative to others. And when you're ready to speak about the crisis, it could be very tough to get your side out of it after everyone else has been weighing in and trying to control the narrative. So that's step one in any crisis. Don't wait. Say something, do something, and don't let others take control of the narrative.
Definitely. Definitely. It's trying to get what control you can in order to get to that place where you can start to move forward. It's pivotal. And I think one thing that you also emphasize in your work and that we've seen, in studying presidential history is this trying to understand the scope. Because as we've seen at numerous points in American history, sometimes business crises can feed into larger national and international situations, like the various financial panics of the 19th century and the 2008 financial crisis. And in a world that is increasingly connected, and you had mentioned AI earlier as a potential area of risk, we're starting to see these different types of impacts, such as cybersecurity concerns and technology outages. And so, what lessons do you think modern business leaders and public policy folks can learn from your book in order to mitigate having such large scale and far reaching negative impacts?
Well, the three major lessons are to prepare, practice, and pay attention. By prepare, I mean make sure you've prepared crisis management plans, especially addressing worst case scenarios in case those scenarios become a reality. Update the plans on a regular basis to account for the latest dangers and threats. Another way to prepare is to appoint crisis response teams before you have a crisis so they're ready to jump in a situation. In fact, to help make it as easy as possible for your audience for preparing a crisis management plan, I'm happy to offer a free crisis management plan template that I prepared on my website at crisiscasebook.com. That's crisiscasebook.com. They can go to the website, and at the top of the navigation bar, there's a link for a free crisis management plan template. Simply click on that, you'll immediately receive the template. And it's a Word document that anyone can scale up or scale down, no matter how large or small their company is, to make sure that they have the basics covered for a crisis and guidance on what to do and the information they need in order to have an intelligent approach to managing a crisis. The next P is practice. Practice testing responses to the plans on the teams on a regular basis. If you don't test the teams and don't test the plans, you have no idea if they're going to work when they're needed. And the final P, the three Ps, is pay attention. Pay very close attention to what's happening in the world, your industry, your profession, and how the latest developments, latest trends could impact your company and organization. And if it's going to have a negative impact, take steps right now to prepare and plan and do what it takes to help prevent or mitigate a negative impact on what's happening in the real world.
Definitely. And for our listeners, I will have a link to the website for the template that Edward was talking about on the page for this episode on my website. And I'll also share that information out. So thank you so much for sharing that. And yes, and that's one of the things that, in this increasingly changing world, and, AI is one of those things. I was actually talking with a colleague yesterday about, the potential risk factors for it, how it can be a valuable tool, and also there is that potential for disaster, and trying to stay aware of what may happen and prepare for that instance is just so key. And it's challenging in a world that is moving faster, it seems, than ever before. And it's still so critical to keep our hands on the pulse to know what's going on.
Definitely. Another challenge is the fact that there are billions of cell phones around the world, and everyone has access to share what they know, what they think, or what they want other people to know or to think on their phone. Just think about it. There are hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people who can cause a crisis simply because of their access to technology. That's why it's absolutely critical that businesses have what I call a social media monitoring system to pay close attention to what's being said about them on all the social media platforms. And if they see anything that might trigger a crisis or be a problem that could morph into a crisis, they shouldn't wait. They should take steps immediately when they find out about the situation, help diffuse the situation, or activate their crisis management plans if they have it in case a problem becomes a crisis. But unless you're paying attention now, real time, 24/7, you run the risk of being very surprised when you have a crisis, and you might be the last one to find out about it.
Definitely. Well, and to take us back to a time when information didn't travel quite as fast and communication wasn't quite as fast, because you also wrote a book about the history of whistle stop campaigns, which was fascinating to me, thinking about what this process was like, and how it evolved over time. And so, in a tie into your work about crisis management, I wanted to ask you about Andrew Johnson's Swing Around the Circle tour, which rather than resolving the crisis he was already in, only compounded it. And indeed, as you wrote, quote, although Johnson was met by enthusiastic and appreciative crowds at the start of his journey, the reception he received worsened as the train made its way around the country. And so I was wondering if you could tell us about this tour and what we can learn about what not to do in crisis management from Johnson's example.
Yes, he's a great example of what not to do. Johnson, of course, was vice president under Abraham Lincoln. Johnson became president when Lincoln was assassinated. And Johnson took a whistle stop tour in 1866 to help bolster the midterm congressional, the candidates he favored, his party favored in the midterm election, and to help promote his policies. He was the first incumbent president to campaign from the back of the train. And he conducted an 18-day whistle stop tour around the circle, and it was dubbed the swing around the circle because of the circular route that his train took. It went from Washington, D.C., through Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, and Kentucky, and back to the nation's capital. You're right. Although he was met at train stations by very enthusiastic and appreciative crowds when he started, the longer the trip went on, the worse things that happened to him. The crowds kind of turned on him, but it was a self-inflicted crisis, frankly. People started to heckling him at different railroad stations because of his unpopular policies he was advocating. He was not a great public speaker. People didn't like his speaking style, and they remembered stories that had been verified that he was actually drunk when he was sworn in as Abraham's vice president. So those were not good images for him to have at the start of the trip. But he didn't stand and take it. He yelled back at his hecklers. He would argue with them at the rallies, at depots, and other places where he would campaign over the course of the 18-day trip. They taunted him, and he taunted them right back. So talk about making matters worse. It was not good, and he could have had a much better end to the trip, but he really essentially dug a hole for himself, and he kept on digging himself deeper into that hole. So a series of PR mistakes. He referred himself as a martyr. Again, he was putting himself on on a pedestal. He was patting himself on the back, and people they don't appreciate that. They don't appreciate it then. They don't appreciate it now. So there are some important lessons to learn. Politicians as well as executives can learn from Johnson's horrible experience. Lesson one: don't do or say anything that's inflammatory. We're going to get people riled up. Number two, be very careful how you promote and praise yourself. You know, the old saying is true: self praise is no recommendation. You can toot your home by about your records and your accomplishments, but know that there's a fine line from a promotion to being too self congratulatory and having too high of an opinion about yourself. And number three, don't get into heated conversations with people who criticize you. And finally, expect some pushback and blowback when you're acting bad, when you're saying bad things, you're making bad decisions. Don't expect for people to be quiet. They're going to push back, they're going to criticize you. If they think you're too big for your britches, they're going to try to put you in your place. So, those are the major lessons to learn from Andrew Johnson's failed whistle stop campaign train tour.
Well, and one of the things that, in this swing around the circle tour, not only the crowds just increasingly it just getting more contentious, but then also the people that he was traveling with, I know that they were just kind of cringing in the backgrounds like this is not going well. And that was one of the fascinating things about your book because you really help us to kind of see what those relationships are on the trains for better or worse. Sometimes it can be more contentious, sometimes things are running well, and thinking about how, when you're in this campaign tour, the positive or negative impact that can have on the people that the candidate's traveling with.
Oh, that's a very good point. There's a cartoon that I include in the book. Ulysses S. Grant, who of course was a general for the Union Army in the Civil War, he was on the train, and at some point in the tour, people stopped supporting or praising Johnson, and they started yelling for Grant to come out and speak. They started chanting, "Grant, Grant, Grant." Uh, so I'm sure that did not sit well with Johnson. And there was some speculation that because of the way Johnson campaigned and because of the way people started chanting Grant's name, that actually might have contributed to efforts for Grant to think about running for president, which he did eventually.
Absolutely. And it's such a fascinating subject because there's so many dynamics going on, and you even described kind of how it was this isolated experience. You just had these folks traveling together for a period of time, kind of in their own microcosm, and then, facing these crowds and all these situations. And it was just fascinating. I know you mentioned in your book, Whistle Stop Politics, that your interest in campaign trains developed while you were working as a press secretary for Representative Mickey Edwards of Oklahoma. Would you mind telling us about that experience on a whistle stop campaign and what insights you gained from your in depth research of the history of campaign trains?
Yes, I was Edwards's press secretary, and then I took time off to work on his campaign. And it was a good news, bad news situation for the congressman. The good news is he wasn't facing any opposition when I started working on the campaign. The bad news is he really wanted publicity about his campaign, even though he didn't have any opposition. So he turned to me and said, "Segal, I want you to generate publicity." I said, "How am I going to do that? You don't have any opposition. No one cares." And he said, "That's not my problem. That's your problem." Thank you very much, Congressman. So I put my thinking hat on and I took a look at what might be interesting and newsworthy. And I had remembered that years ago, Harry Truman did an old fashioned whistle stop campaign tour in Oklahoma and around the same set of tracks that were still running through the congressman's district. They were at the time unused Amtrak train tracks. The Amtrak had stopped running a train in the state years before, But apparently, based on my research, the tracks were still usable. So what I did in conjunction with our campaign, we were able to rent a train for a whole day from Santa Fe. I think there was 2 engines and a couple passenger cars and a rear car, and we rented that train. We took a 102-mile trip from the Kansas border down to Oklahoma City. We had 3 or 4 stops along the way. We had arranged for rallies and TV crews and marching bands and a lot of rah-rah at each step. And it was just a really great event. It was probably one of the best political events I ever attended or helped to organize. It was so interesting that the New York Times actually did a brief story, the fact that we were going to be doing a campaign train tour. So we were in the news of all the radio and television stations. We brought a lot of reporters with us on the train, and it really made the congressman very happy to have all the reporters on board, and really, really happy to see the resulting news coverage. But based on my research, there were several lessons to be drawn from that trip and from the hundreds of campaign train tours I've been documented in my book. Lesson one is that the trains were used by politicians to reach as many people as possible. That's why campaign train staff and the candidates would make sure that their trains would stop as many depots in the largest cities and the smallest towns, and sometimes just even the wide spots in the road. If there were people who were gathered by there, the train would stop. There's a famous story of, I think it was FDR, whose train, it was one of his cross country tours. There were only 4 people standing in a wide part of the road, no crossing. They were just standing there. And he became aware of it and had his train stop just so he could talk to 4 people. So those kinds of organized, scheduled, and impromptu trackside rallies were really important to reach as many people as possible. Another lesson from whistle-stopping politicians, don't talk so much. keep, keep the speeches short. Whistle-stopping politicians would often speak for maybe 5 or 15 minutes from the back of their trains. Why? Because they would have a schedule to speak to keep on, and the brief remarks would help guarantee that the trains stayed on schedule and would not keep crowds waiting at the next depot down the road. But there was also another reason. They may not have been the only train on the track, so they did want to have a run-in with another train, and sometimes there was 2 trains on one track, and it was a matter of scheduling. So keep it short, don't talk so much, and stay on schedule. Another lesson is customized remarks. The standard stump speech that politicians would give were usually customized and localized for audiences where the train would stop, and the candidate or their staff would have done their homework to tailor the remarks to make sure they reflected the candidate's knowledge or awareness of the interests, concerns of the people who's talking to, the area's major accomplishments, local heroes, attractions, history. He just wanted to make sure that the people he was talking to could identify with him and that he knew the people he was talking to. So customization was really important. Another lesson was the importance of props and visuals to help get your point across. Whistle stopping politicians would sometimes use props to help make their points to the crowd, not just talking about their points, but visualize their points. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, running for the White House, he effectively demonstrated to audiences at trackside rallies what he claimed was the shrinking power of the dollar. He would often display a piece of lumber about 3 feet long that was sawed almost through and through to 2 different places. Eisenhower said that the full length of lumber he was holding symbolized the value of the dollar when FDR became president. Then Eisenhower would break off one piece to show its value when Roosevelt died in 1945. Then Eisenhower broke off the second piece to show what was worth during Truman's presidency. So that was a great, effective way for Eisenhower to not just make the point, but to show the point and help that point stick in the minds of the people he was talking to. Another great lesson from whistle stopping politicians is practice, practice, practice. Uh, Candidates who would speak on the back of trains, they would often rehearse their speeches, and those who practiced their speeches before giving them usually performed much better than those who preferred to wing it or didn't even have a chance to look at the remarks that were prepared by the staff, just thrust in their hands right before they were about to speak. And that's never a good way to give any candidate a good experience, or to help have a good leave the public with a good image about you. So practicing, perfecting techniques, those are the lessons that politicians today can learn, and also executives who give public speeches and other presentations, they can learn from whistle stopping politicians.
Absolutely. There are definitely good lessons there. And just like in the crisis case book, I think there's some, lessons of what you want to do, your best practices, but then also the what not to do's. Because, in Whistle Stop Politics, you also talked about some campaign train tours that didn't go quite so well. And of the many that you studied, besides the aforementioned Swing Around the Circle tour, which do you think was the biggest failure and why?
Well, I've documented about 200 whistle stopping politicians. The first one, as soon as there was a stretch of tracks and that could carry a candidate, they started using them. So that was like in the 1830s. It didn't go too far, of course, because trains didn't go too far. But over the course of 185 years, there have been hundreds of whistle stopping politicians for state, federal, and even local offices. But I think the biggest failure of those 200 was Richard Nixon's campaign train tour in 1952, when he was running for vice president as Dwight Eisenhower's running mate. And Nixon's tour really got off to a pretty bad start. He started in California and was going to go up the West Coast through Oregon and the state of Washington. And just a few hours after his train left the first station in Southern California, there started to be news accounts about allegations that Nixon had improperly used private funds to help pay for political related expenses such as travel and postage. And as the news reports started to be published up and down the West Coast, he started to get heckled at almost every railroad station where his train would stop for rallies between California and Oregon. The allegations of impropriety were so serious that there was also serious consideration by campaign officials for Eisenhower that Eisenhower would actually drop Nixon from the ticket as being too much of a liability. But Nixon saved himself by going on television and making what was later called the checkers speech to help save his candidacy and explain the truth about the situation. And it was called the checkers speech because of a Cocker Spaniel, a dog that was given to Nixon for his daughters by a supporter. And Nixon swore that he would never give up the dog, never would give up checkers. So that was a great example of a politician saving himself from a crisis that could have ended very badly. He did so well with the speech that Eisenhower and his aides decided to keep Nixon on the ticket. They won, of course, and that was the start of a long career in politics for President Nixon. But I don't think he would have gotten as far as he did in politics if he hadn't saved himself and turned things around from that early crisis.
And Nixon is just such a fascinating figure to study for so many reasons. And there are those crisis points in his career that, things could have, and using the pun here, derailed, at many different points. And it was fascinating to read about that campaign train and to get the context of, when this crisis started and how it impacted and completely changed what they were hoping to do with that campaign tour.
Ironically, his career was bookmarked by two crises. One, of course, was in 1952. and the other one was Watergate. He recovered from one crisis, and it was Watergate that really ended his political career. And the Watergate, of course, was much more of a self inflicted crisis than the first one, but he never recovered from Watergate, obviously. And most people don't even think about or know, or sometimes don't even care about Nixon's accomplishments in his political career. They just focus in on his last devastating crisis, Watergate.
Absolutely, and that's the thing, I think everybody and, even beyond politics, we all face crises at some point, and it really does become how do we manage it or not that can make or break our legacy and how we're viewed by other people. So it's fascinating to see that in that context. So turning to the other side, thinking of the best practices, what worked well, who do you think was the most successful whistle stop campaigner that you studied, and what made them such a success in utilizing that mode of campaigning?
Well, without a doubt, I think President Franklin D. Roosevelt was the most successful whistle stop campaign trainer. In fact, he holds a record for the number of whistle stop campaign train tours. He made almost 400 trips,
Wow.
traveled about 350,000 miles, and delivered hundreds of speeches along the way. No other candidate comes even close to his use of the train to reach and connect voters. But he was had a lot of experience with campaign trains before he ran for president. He was on a ticket to run for vice president in 1920, I believe. And as part of his campaign for vice president, which he didn't win, of course, he traveled on the back of a train. And that was his first opportunity, really, to hone his skills and his expertise in talking to voters from the back of the train. So that experience served him in good stead when he ran for president in 1932. But there are several reasons why FDR was so successful. First, of course, the trains when he was running for president were very well organized. They were also very well publicized, which helped, of course, to help turn out big crowds at train stations across the country. And the publicity ahead of the trains, the people who would come out to listen to him, that helped generate favorable, almost headline, front page headline stories about his campaign train tours. He also had a great speaking style that resonated with people. He spoke with people, not to them and not at them. He had much more of a conversational style than most politicians had, and people responded very well. He kept his speeches short, again, because his train had a schedule to meet, maybe 5 or 10 minutes before it went on to the next railroad station. He kept his remarks focused on local issues at each stop and had a good sense of humor. And I have a transcript of some of his speeches in the Whistle Stop book, and you could almost hear him speak. They were just so conversational. He got along well with people. People had the sense that he knew them, that he was listening to them, and that he understood them. And that's always great traits in any politicians. But those were some of the contributing factors of why his train trips were so successful.
Well, and it's fascinating thinking of FDR, and he's definitely an example of someone who identified the tools at his disposal and utilized them well. And even, when he was facing crises, he was able to get that information that he needed and being able to communicate to folks and with folks in an effective manner that completely shaped how folks at the time and his legacy is viewed.
He also had a couple things that we don't worry about today for whistle stopping politicians. As president, he had an incredible security force. On some of his trips, he had members of the armed services lining the tracks to help ensure nothing would go wrong. At one point, according to my research, he had 150,000 soldiers lining the tracks of the routes of one of his campaign train tours. You would never see anything like that. Of course, there had been modern whistle stopping presidents. George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, Clinton, Biden. They would have their own security details and precautions to make sure the trips were safe. But during the time that FDR traveled during World War II, whether it was as president or as a candidate running for the White House, the security was absolutely incredible.
Definitely. Well, and as we wrap up our conversation, I wanted to ask you, what has been your greatest takeaway from studying crisis management? And what is the key lesson you would impart to our listeners in dealing with the times that life doesn't go according to plan?
Well, a couple basics. Basic number one, don't assume or hope or deny that a crisis will never ever happen to your company or organization. Denial is not a strategy. Hope is not a strategy. You have to be prepared. And the more prepared you are for a crisis, that your company or organization is ready for a crisis, the more likely it is that you and they will be successful in managing, mitigating, and preparing for a crisis, and also take steps to recover from the crisis and bounce back and get back to normal as quickly as possible. And the other thing is pay attention. Don't look at the world through rose colored glasses or a set of binders. Pay attention to what's happening in the world and make sure that your plan and your team and your practicing for worst case scenarios that they reflect what's happening in the world, what could go wrong, and how, if it does go wrong, how it's going to impact you, and do what you can to prevent or mitigate the impact as much as possible.
Definitely. Well, Edward, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your insights with us, for helping us to understand crisis management and also more presidential history, campaign history. There's so much in your work. And to our listeners, I will have links to Edward's work on the page for this episode. On my website, I highly recommend picking up his books. There's a wealth of information and so much more that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you can find there. Thank you so much for joining us on Presidencies.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so much again to Edward Segal for the insight that he provided in our conversation. And be sure to check out both of his books, The Crisis Casebook, Lessons in Crisis Management from the World's Leading Brands, and Whistle Stop Politics, Campaign Trains and the Reporters Who Covered Them. Links to more information, including how to purchase both of them, can be found on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to more about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidencies podcast. Speaking of, I wanted to do a special shout out to all the patrons who have recently signed up to support the podcast. Thank you so much to Scott, Tyler, Andrew, and Mark. Some have been longtime listeners, while others are still fairly new to the podcast. Regardless, I cannot begin to tell you how much it means to me that you believe so much in what I'm doing here to help provide financial support so that I can have the equipment and resources needed to keep this good work going. They, along with all patrons, get access to an ad-free feed for the podcast, which also includes some special patron-exclusive episodes. I just finished up a series on the Postmasters General prior to the office becoming a cabinet-level post. And next up, I'm going to share some outtakes from the Calhoun episode. That's right. Despite going for 3 episodes and over 4 hours of audio, there is still material from the Calhoun outline and research that ended up on the cutting room floor. And I can't wait to share that with our patrons. If you'd like to become a patron of the Presidencies podcast, just go to patreon.com/presidencies and sign up. If you're not able to commit to a monthly donation, there are other ways that you can support the podcast. I have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidencies podcast with books identified that will help to prepare for upcoming episodes. You can also leave a rating and review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Podchaser, or anywhere else with that capability. I cannot thank all of you who have fulfilled book requests as well as shared with folks why they too should be listening to the Presidencies podcast. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me via email at presidentiespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcasts. Last but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kan du norsk?
If you used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world, with lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers. Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Spotify. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify. Rules and restrictions may apply.